Hey Film Buffs, welcome back to Film Feature 43, where our motto is...
The best way to spread Christmas cheer is singing loud for all to hear.
Today we're doing another 43 Facts video. This time we're talking about the 2003 holiday classic Elf. So without further ado, let's get into talking about the facts. The original script for Elf was written way back in 1993, and the premise was supposed to be a live-action Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, where a misfit was cast out by people we considered his friends and family, and ultimately came back to save Christmas. The movie Big was also a big inspiration in the fish out of water, naive child in an adult world scenario that the writer was trying to craft with Buddy. In the original script, Buddy was actually bullied by the elves, much like Rudolph was with the other reindeer. It's not hard to see why when you see this deleted scene of Buddy just beating the crap out of the elves in a game of ice hockey. But the bullying stuff was ultimately dropped because they wanted Buddy to be endlessly optimistic. And how can you be endlessly optimistic when you're being bullied constantly? So they fixed that by making the elves also endlessly optimistic. In the 1990s, the rights were optioned by Motion Picture Corporation of America, with the stipulation that the movie would start to be being made within a year, but they wanted Chris Farley, and writer David Berenbaum did not, so he just decided to not make the movie, and the contract lapsed. Who he really wanted in the 90s, after Chris Farley was kind of shooed away, was Jim Carrey, but that never came to fruition. What actually happened was, early 2000s, they signed an unknown actor in Will Ferrell, and New Line Cinema said that they would produce the movie, but they needed a director. They found said director in Jon Favreau, which was a suggestion by Vince Vaughn, who worked with Johnny Favs on his one and only directorial outing at the time the movie made. Favreau had 3 conditions on him making this film, the first of which is it had to have a Rankin Bass aesthetic, meaning costumes, and there had to be some kind of stop motion in the film. Also, it had to be a family film. He wanted to make something for his son, who was just a little kid at the time. And finally, it had to be timeless, so no references to pop culture of the day. It had to be something that could be watched year after year after year. Speaking of Favreau's son, you actually see him in the film as Buddy's growing up. He's one of the little buddies. Favreau's son is not the only cameo in this film. Will Ferrell's younger brother is actually one of the security guards that kicks him out of Gimbals. And Ming Ming the Elf was played by Peter Billingsley, who was Ralphie from The Christmas Story. Favreau's son wasn't the only younger Buddy in the film as well. The baby Buddy in the orphanage was actually played by triplet girls. It was originally supposed to be played by twin boys who looked exactly like Will Ferrell, but they wouldn't stop crying, so they were fired and the triplets were brought in. Production started in New York City, filming guerrilla style, paying extras on the street who weren't actors, just randos, a small amount of money to be in the movie, all except for the jogger dressed in red that Will Ferrell runs up to yelling, that was just a jogger, and he had no idea what was going on. They also caused minor traffic accidents in the scene where Buddy's going through the Lincoln Tunnel, because they literally did that during rush hour, and people were looking at this idiot dressed in an elf costume, and it caused fender benders in the Lincoln Tunnel. And one of the exterior shots was actually a famous location, specifically Buddy's dad's apartment building. It was Dana Barrett's apartment building in the movie Ghostbusters as well. Most of the interior shots, like the apartment and the office building, and the mailroom, and the orphanage, and Gimbals, and Santa's workshop, were all sets inside of an abandoned asylum. Set asylum being used in a lot of TV shows and movies, but just to name a few, they was used in Happy Gilmore, and Riverdale, and Freddy vs. Jason, and the beginning and end of Deadpool 2. Jon Favreau refused to use CGI to make Will Ferrell look bigger than the rest of the elves, so they were forced to use forced perspective to make him look bigger. The most famous scene for this is probably when Buddy is sitting on Papa Elf's lap. How they did this was Will Ferrell was sitting above a child's legs, and the child was laying on a board back so you couldn't see his body, and Bob Newhart was sitting behind them about 10 feet, so he looked smaller than Will. On a side note, speaking of Papa Elf, if Jon Favreau would have got his way, Bob Newhart wouldn't have been Papa, it would have been Chevy Chase, And Will Ferrell was adamantly against that because he worked with Chevy Chase as a guest host on Saturday Night Live and said he was the worst host to work with. And thank goodness, I think, because I can't see Chevy being Papa. I mean, look at the job he did with Rusty and Audrey.
Can't see the line, can you, Russ?
No.
Going back to Force perspective, they actually started running behind because they had to set up all the individual shots, and it took hours to set up each shot. So they had a night crew that actually came in the night before and set up every individual shot before the rest of the crew got there. And it didn't help that they thought that they were going to be in legal trouble with Rankin and Bass over the costuming issue. They thought that Rankin and Bass had it copyrighted, so they began to have to shoot every scene twice. Once wearing a green and yellow costume that we all know, and one wearing a blue costume. Luckily, the legal troubles went away because Rankin and Bass actually didn't have Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer properly copyrighted, so any copyright claim that they had fell through. Copyright wasn't the only reason that they shot every scene twice. They also shot scenes twice for Will Ferrell to have the opportunity to improvise. The scene most infamous for this is where Will Ferrell is tickling James Caan, and that made James Caan extremely uncomfortable, and they did that take over and over and over again, ultimately making James pretty mad. A lot of people on set was afraid of James Caan, but when Will Ferrell first met him, he ran up and hugged him and yelled, "Dad!" Again, making Jimmy really uncomfortable. They also had to shoot the spaghetti scene twice, and not due to improvising, due to the fact that Will Ferrell threw up the first time because of how much sugar was in it. During filming of Elf, he ate so much sugar that he had terrible headaches the whole way throughout, and he couldn't sleep most of the time while he was filming. One scene that was shot only one time was the fake Santa Lego scene.
You sit on a throne of lies.
Because all the Legos were too hard to put back together, they only shot it one time. They got one take. And so kids were not present during that because they didn't want kids messing it up. And obviously, safety reasons, because you don't want a kid ruining a take by taking a Lego to the eye. So what they did was they filmed the kids screaming and cheering, and then they did use CGI green screen for Buddy and Santa going at it with a stanchion and Legos. All of the store scenes that we see in Gimbals was actually supposed to be Macy's, and they agreed to let Elf use their name, but they had one stipulation, and that was to take the fake Santa scenes out, and the producer of Elf refused because they thought that was one of the best scenes, so they switched to Gimbals instead of Macy's. And speaking of Gimbals, the manager's name, if you look closely, is actually Wanda, and that's because Wanda Sykes was supposed to fill that role, but she dropped out unexpectedly at the very last minute, so they got Faison Love to fill that role instead. And a little side note while we're on the topic of Mall Santa, before he ever played Buddy the Elf, Will Ferrell was actually a Mall Santa in California, and his Night at the Roxbury co-star Chris Caan was his elf. And another sweet little fact you may not have known, during the doctor's office scene, the cotton balls that Will Ferrell is eating is actually made of undyed cotton candy. Speaking of the doctor scene, everyone here probably knows that the doctor was played by Jon Favreau, but what you might not know is he voiced Mr. Narwhal and the other Arctic puppets.
Bye, buddy. Hope you find your dad.
Thanks, Mr. Narwhal.
As well as drawing the To Dad card that Buddy gives to Walter during the movie. And he had a remote control for the last Jack in the Box to spring it so Will Ferrell would actually be surprised. He wanted it to be as authentic as possible, so behind the camera, he pushed a button to trigger it. The laugh of said Jack in the Box is done by Dal McKinnon, and it's actually the same laugh from the hyenas in Lady and the Tramp, and the hyenas at Disney's Magic Kingdom, and Ripperoo in Crash Bandicoot. And Will's reaction to that Jack in the Box was not the only thing done for real in this movie. As I mentioned before, they used stop motion for a lot of the winter scene, except for the snow. That was done in CGI. But doing stop motion for those winter scenes actually put them behind schedule again, and they ran into a big executive meeting where the stop motion had to be done. So to give credit where credit is due, the main animator Teresa Drilling worked 27 hours straight to get the stop motion ready to show to the executives. The film was finally finished, but the executives at New Line took the final cut away from Jon Favreau because Old School came out and launched Will Ferrell to stardom, so they wanted it to be less kid-friendly and more in the vein of old school, so they made a cut, completely cutting out all the Central Park singing around the world scenes, and they showed it to audiences, and it utterly failed, so they gave it back to Johnny Favs. During the Central Park scene, they actually used real reindeer who were afraid of Will Ferrell, and that scene was actually supposed to be a lot bigger, with a police chase, and Will Ferrell jumping off of a skyscraper onto a helicopter, but they toned it down for a more down-to-earth ending at the request of Jon Favreau. When it was all said and done, this movie made $220 million on a budget of $33 million, so you could say it was pretty successful. But we haven't got a sequel to it because Will Ferrell repeatedly turned down a $29 million payday to reprise his role as Buddy the Elf. To put that in perspective, he only made $2 million off the first movie, so that'd be about 15 times more, and $29 million payday. The original movie had a $33 million budget, so that was almost the entire budget of the first Elf. But maybe this is all a good thing, because 20-plus-year-old sequels rarely are ever as good as the original. But those are the facts that I have. Let me know what you guys think down below. What movies do you want me to cover? And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.